never believed in angelic visitations. I believed in God, yes. I went to church, said my prayers, and tried to live a good life. But angels? That felt like something reserved for Sunday school stories or Renaissance paintings, not something that would show up in my living room at 3:07 a.m. on a Thursday. But there he was. I was jolted awake, not by a sound, but by a presence. The air felt heavier somehow, like the silence was full of something sacred. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Everything was still, yet charged. The curtains were unmoved, my clock still blinking its neon blue digits. That's when I saw the figure by the doorway. He didn't enter. He just stood there, bathed in a light that didn't come from anywhere in my house. No wings, no harp, just power, just clarity, and eyes that felt like they saw every part of me, the broken, the brave, the bitter, the believing. He didn't speak with his mouth. It was more like the words echoed inside my chest. You keep praying for confirmation. So I've come. I couldn't breathe. My lips parted, but nothing came out. I didn't need to ask who he was. I knew. I am Michael, the voice continued, and I carry messages from the throne. Tears burned my eyes before I even knew why. I hadn't been praying for a message about my future spouse, not lately. That part of my life was one big unanswered question. I was tired of hoping, tired of trying to read signs that weren't there. I'd been in relationships that seemed almost right, but never fully aligned. I dated people who checked the boxes, but something always felt off, like I was showing up to a movie that had already ended. I thought maybe love just wasn't in the cards for me. Maybe I was supposed to serve in other ways, stay single, stay focused. But here stood an angel, Michael no less, saying otherwise. You've been looking in the wrong direction. You've searched faces and names, hoping one would feel like home. But the one destined for you has already been near. Near? I tried to speak, to ask who, but he held up his hand. The name is not what you think, he said. And that's why you've missed it. You've prayed for a David, but it is not David. You looked for Elijah, but it is not Elijah. I didn't understand. What name had I expected? What assumptions had I made? This person has moved through your life quietly, unnoticed, unglamorous, unassuming, but appointed, marked, aligned. A chill ran through me. I mentally scanned through every man I'd interacted with over the past year. Most of them were forgettable. Some were kind, a few flirtatious. But none had stood out, at least not in the way we romanticize in movies. He will not come to you the way others have. He will not pursue you in the patterns of this world. But when your eyes open, you'll recognize him by his fruit. Michael's tone was firm but gentle. Peace, patience, loyalty, humility, a warrior's heart, hidden under ordinary skin. I wanted to scream, "Tell me who he is!" But the words wouldn't come. You must be still enough to see, the angel said, because you've been looking through the eyes of longing instead of the eyes of alignment. You've wanted chemistry. God desires covenant. It felt like a sword cutting through every assumption I'd carried about love. The fairy tales, the tension-filled romance novels, the curated Instagram love stories. They had trained me to expect fireworks. But what if God's version of love was more like a slow-burning fire that never went out? A presence, not a performance? Michael stepped closer, and the light intensified. Not painfully, just undeniably. Your spirit has already begun to recognize him, even if your mind has not. In the coming weeks, the veil will lift, your clarity will increase. But do not delay with doubt. When your eyes are opened, you must act. Act on what? Say something? Do something? This is not only about your heart. It is about destiny. There are assignments you can only fulfill together. The weight of that landed like a quiet thud inside my chest. My love life wasn't just about me. It was a piece of something larger, a purpose that required unity. A partnership not built just for emotional support, but spiritual mission. And then the light began to fade. Remember, Michael said as his form began to blur like smoke. "He does not carry the name you expect, but he carries the heart you've prayed for." With that, he was gone. The room was dark again, cold, normal, and yet nothing about me felt normal anymore. I sat in bed, trembling, heart thudding so loud it echoed in my ears. I looked around the room to confirm I wasn't dreaming, but everything was exactly where it had been before I went to sleep. Except now, I carried a message I hadn't asked for and couldn't ignore. Destined, already near. The name is not what you think. That last line haunted me for days.
I replayed the moment over and over in my mind, half afraid I'd made it up, half certain I hadn't. I went to work, saw my friends, smiled at strangers, but I was watching everyone differently. Listening, noticing. Every time someone said,
A name I didn't expect, my ears perked up. Was it James from the coffee shop? We barely spoke, but he always remembered my order. Was it Marcus, the youth pastor who was kind but quiet? Never once flirtatious, was it? No. I stopped myself. I was spiraling. Michael had said I would know by the fruit, not the flash, not the name, the fruit. But how was I supposed to see that in passing conversations? How was I supposed to spot destiny in a crowded room? I didn't know. But I knew I had to pay attention. I started to journal everything, every detail I could recall from that night. The look in Michael's eyes, the exact words he spoke, the way his presence felt like gravity and light at the same time. I needed to preserve it. Not just so I wouldn't forget, but so I could recognize when the signs started to show. Over the next few days, I felt like I was walking through the world with a veil slowly lifting. I saw people differently. I listened more carefully. I even noticed how often I rushed past the quiet ones, distracted by charisma instead of character. Michael's words echoed again. You must be still enough to see. Stillness wasn't something I was good at. My brain had a permanent buzz, always thinking, always analyzing, always preparing for the worst. I'd trained myself to expect disappointment, to guard against hope. And now, I was being asked to walk through life like a watchman, alert to the subtle movements of God. That required surrender. That required trust. It terrified me. One afternoon, I stopped by a local bookstore. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just wandering, killing time. That's when I saw him, Elias. We'd met months ago through mutual friends. We only talked briefly at a small group once or twice, never anything personal. He was quiet, thoughtful, kind, the kind of person you might accidentally overlook in a room full of louder personalities. He didn't command attention. He just was. He was crouched by a shelf in the theology section, flipping through a book on spiritual disciplines. His brows were furrowed in thought. His hoodie sleeves were pushed up to his elbows, revealing a scar along his forearm. I'd never noticed it before. I'd never looked long enough. He saw me, smiled, and stood up. "Hey," he said, with that gentle kind of voice that feels like a question and a greeting at the same time. I smiled back, but something inside me shifted. It wasn't a romantic flutter or instant connection. It was deeper, quieter, like an internal compass tugging north. My spirit leaned toward him even while my mind stayed silent. We chatted for a minute, small talk mostly. He asked how I was doing. I asked what he was reading. He held up the book and said, "Trying to get better at hearing God. You know how it is?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I really do." That was it. He didn't ask for my number. I didn't offer it. There was no flirty banter, no suggestive body language. It was just peaceful, like a breeze brushing across my soul, not forcing anything, just reminding me that it was there. After I left the store, I sat in my car for a while, just breathing. Was that him? Was Elias the one Michael spoke about? I wanted to be cautious. I didn't want to turn this into some obsessive search, but I also couldn't ignore the resonance I felt. I pulled out my journal again and wrote his name down. Elias, not David, not Elijah. Elias, and I remembered what Michael had said. You prayed for a David, but it is not David. Could that have been literal? Had I prayed for someone with that name or someone like that? Strong, visible, bold, kingly. Elias was the opposite. He was like a psalm in human form, quiet, steady, rooted. Over the next week, I began to pay closer attention to who Elias was, through mutual friends, group messages, shared church circles. I didn't stalk, I just observed. The more I watched, the more I saw the fruit. He showed up when no one else did. Not for attention, but out of consistency. He served without needing a title. He prayed when no one asked him to. He apologized when he made mistakes. He asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers. One night during Bible study, a guest speaker didn't show up. Everyone looked around awkwardly, unsure what to do. Without hesitation, Elias stepped up, not to preach, but to lead a time of simple worship and prayer. He didn't perform, he invited. And the whole room shifted. It was subtle, but powerful. Afterward, someone joked, "Man, Elias, you're like the emergency pastor." He laughed and shrugged. "I just try to be available." That line stayed with me. I just try to be available. It sounded simple. But in a world full of people chasing platforms and validation, that kind of availability was rare, sacred even. That night I prayed again, not to ask for more signs, but to surrender my assumptions. I laid down my timelines, my wish list, my fears. I just said, "God, if it's him, open my eyes, and if it's not, keep me from deception." The next morning I woke up with a phrase heavy on my heart, like a whisper echoing from somewhere eternal. "The name is not what you think, but the purpose is more than you imagined." And I knew then, this wasn't just about recognizing someone, it was about becoming someone. Someone ready, someone aligned. Because destiny isn't just about who you're with, it's about who you are when they arrive. I started seeing Elias everywhere after that. Not in a forced, creepy way, but in a way that made it clear I was supposed to notice. At church, at community events, even at the same coffee shop I always went to, though I'd never once seen him there before. Each time, there was no grand interaction, no fate-sealing moment, just presence, just peace, and that same quiet pull in my spirit, like a soft breeze reminding me I was facing the right direction. Still, I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if this was just my imagination weaving signs into coincidences? I didn't want to get caught up in spiritual fantasy. I didn't want to misinterpret divine silence as divine approval. I wanted to walk carefully, but I also didn't want to walk in circles anymore. So I fasted 3 days, nothing dramatic, just intentional. I turned down distractions. I turned off social media. I ate simply. I sat with the Word and prayed one specific prayer over and over. God, show me what's real. And if I'm getting in the way of what you're doing, take me out of the way. On the second night of the fast, I had a dream. It wasn't like the encounter with Michael. No blinding light, no spoken revelation. But it felt just as real. In the dream, I was standing in a field with rows of old, weathered olive trees. The sky above was golden, almost like sunset and sunrise were happening at the same time. And standing across from me was Elias, not smiling, not serious, just steady. He didn't speak. He just reached out and handed me something. A seed. Small, unremarkable, but warm in my hand. Then I looked down and realized I was holding a shovel. And right in front of me, the soil had already been turned. When I woke up, the message felt obvious and confusing all at once. He won't hand you a wedding. He'll hand you a seed. You'll have to help plant it. That line dropped into my spirit, like an anchor. The kind of love God writes doesn't usually come pre-packaged with romance and grand gestures. It comes as a beginning, a process, a calling, something two people have to plant, water, and nurture with intention. Elias wasn't offering me a fairy tale. He wasn't promising butterflies and epic passion. He was standing in a field, handing me the seed of something that could become holy, if I was willing to do the work. That morning, I saw him again. It was after church. Everyone was mingling outside, some talking over coffee, others corralling kids or coordinating rides. I was standing near the garden beds behind the sanctuary, absent-mindedly pulling a dried leaf off one of the basil plants, when Elias walked up beside me. "You have a gentle touch," he said quietly. I smiled. "Plants like it better that way." He laughed. "People do too." We stood there in silence for a moment, and then he surprised me. "I've been meaning to ask," he began, shifting slightly. "Do you like hiking?" I blinked. "Yeah, actually. A lot. I don't go often, but I love it." He nodded, clearly relieved. "There's a trail I go to sometimes just to reset. Nothing intense. Would you want to join sometime?" And just like that, the moment turned. I could have said no. I could have overthought it or played it cool. But everything in me whispered, "This is the seed." "Yeah," I said, "I'd really like that." So we went. It wasn't a date, not officially. Just two people walking through the woods, talking about God and growth and the hard parts of waiting. We shared stories, not everything, but enough. I told him about my struggles with trusting God's timing. He told me about losing his dad and how that shaped his view of manhood. At one point, he said something that stuck with me. "You know," he said, kicking a rock off the trail, "I used to think I had to become someone impressive to be worthy of love. But lately I've been learning that being present is more important than being impressive." I stopped walking for a second. That was it. That was the fruit. No arrogance, no need to dominate. Just the humble awareness that love requires presence more than perfection. As we stood by a quiet stream, watching the water ripple over smooth stones, I realized something else. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid of being wrong. I wasn't afraid of the future. I wasn't afraid of whether or not this would turn into a marriage. I just felt aligned. Not in the butterflies and fireworks kind of way, but in the way a compass clicks when it finally finds north. A stillness, a knowing. And maybe that's what Michael meant all along. The name is not what you think, because the name isn't just about letters or labels. It's about identity, about purpose, about who someone is when no one's watching, about what they carry in the quiet. Elias wasn't flashy. He didn't look like destiny, but he was, because he showed up with fruit, not flowers, with presence, not performance. And maybe that's exactly the kind of man God had been preparing me for all along. The next few weeks felt like being slowly unraveled and rewoven at the same time. Elias and I started spending more time together, not every day, and not always alone. Sometimes it was just walking to our cars after church. Other times it was helping out at a food drive or sitting near each other during worship. But there was something intentional in the way we moved around each other. No labels, no pressure, just presence. Quiet, steady presence. And honestly, that kind of consistency was disarming. I was used to the highs and lows of emotional entanglement, used to people who burned bright and then burned out. But Elias was different. He wasn't trying to win me over. He wasn't trying to impress. He was just real. And the more real he was, the more I realized how much of me still needed healing. There was one afternoon, we'd just finished volunteering at a local shelter. We sat in the parking lot in his truck, eating cheap tacos and talking about God. At some point, I shared how I used to measure my worth by how wanted I was, how the silence of waiting used to feel like rejection, how I sometimes wondered if God skipped over me when handing out love stories. Elias didn't interrupt. He just nodded, then looked out the window for a second and said, "You ever think maybe God wasn't holding out on you, but holding you in place long enough so the right person would have time to catch up?" I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. I was too busy feeling the air leave my lungs. Because that's exactly what it felt like I'd been anchored in a season of delay, not as punishment, but as preparation. I thought of what Michael said again. You must be still enough to see. Stillness wasn't punishment. It was positioning. God hadn't been ignoring me. He was aligning me. That night, I went home and sat with the Lord longer than usual. I didn't journal. I didn't put on worship music. I just sat still, letting the silence stretch between us like a conversation in itself. And I heard it again. That voice, not audible, but unmistakable. This is him. Not because he completes you, but because he's been called to build with you. That's when it hit me. Marriage isn't just about compatibility. It's about calling. It's about two people being shaped individually to carry a collective purpose. God wasn't giving me a partner to fix me. He was aligning me with someone who could walk with me in the mundane, in the spiritual, in the mission we hadn't even seen the full scope of yet. And suddenly, I remembered something I had written in my journal almost a year ago. A prayer I had forgotten about. Lord, I don't just want someone to grow old with. I want someone to grow upward with. Someone who challenges my spirit, not just excites my emotions. I pulled the journal from my shelf, flipped through the pages, and found the entry. The date sent chills down my spine. It was almost exactly 1 year to the day before I saw Elias at the bookstore. God had heard me. He had remembered, and Michael's words made more sense now than ever before. You prayed for a David, but it is not David. I had been praying for someone with a kingly spirit, charismatic, bold, visible. But God had chosen someone more like Joseph, obedient, faithful in the hidden places, trustworthy with dreams that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. And the craziest part, Elias didn't know any of this yet. I hadn't told him about the angel, the dream, the field, the seed. I hadn't told him what I was sensing or what the Lord had whispered. Because it wasn't time. Because the story wasn't finished, unfolding yet. Because sometimes when you're walking with God, He asks you to carry revelation quietly until it has matured into confirmation. And so I waited. But the waiting was no longer filled with ache. It was filled with hope. One night, about a month later, Elias asked if I wanted to join him for a sunrise prayer hike. I almost said no, because 5 a.m. is not my spiritual hour, but something told me to say yes. We hiked in silence, just the crunch of gravel under our feet and the soft glow of the sky bleeding pink across the horizon. At the top of the ridge, we sat on a stone ledge and watched the sun emerge. He was quiet for a long time, then turned to me and said, "There's something I've been wanting to share." I looked over, heart suddenly pounding. "I had this dream a few weeks ago," he began. "I was standing in a field, and you were there too. I handed you something small. It might have been a seed, and you had a shovel, and the dirt had already been turned." I froze. He continued, "When I woke up, I didn't know what it meant, but I kept praying about it. And God told me it wasn't about planting something new. It was about building on soil that had already been prepared, that maybe the work's already been done in both of us. And now, it's just time to start." My eyes filled with tears. Hadn't told him about my dream, and yet here it was, mirrored back to me. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't romance. This was divine confirmation. And for the first time, I looked at him, not just as a friend, not just as someone I admired, but as someone God had anointed for my life, not because he completed me, but because he had been called to walk with me into the kind of purpose that only partnership can fulfill. I didn't tell Elias everything that day. I didn't tell him about Archangel Michael. I didn't tell him about the moment in my room when heaven crashed through the silence and rewrote my expectations. I didn't even mention how his dream was nearly identical to mine. Some things, when they're still being written, are too sacred to narrate out loud. But I did tell him this. I think God is showing us something. Something we didn't expect, but maybe something we've both been quietly asking for. He looked at me and nodded, not with surprise, but with the peace of someone who'd already sensed the same thing. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden kiss, just the kind of eye contact that settles deep and stays with you. Over the weeks that followed, things didn't speed up. They deepened. There were no grand gestures or fairy tale moments. We just kept choosing to show up. He started praying. With me, first over the phone and then in person. I learned the rhythm of his spirit, the way he paused when he felt the Holy Spirit nudging him, the way he led without overpowering, the way he listened more than he spoke. One night, while praying together, he said something that landed in my chest like a key in a lock. God didn't make us to impress each other. He made us to intercede for each other. That was it. I didn't need a man to sweep me off my feet. I needed someone who knew how to kneel beside me. And Elias? He knew. He carried something holy, not in title, not in swagger, but in the quiet, sacred way he brought heaven into conversation. He reminded me of how I wanted to be loved, not loudly, but faithfully. Around this time, I started asking the Lord how I should respond. I had received all this revelation, but what was I supposed to do with it? The answer came quietly one morning during prayer. Prepare, not for a wedding, for a covenant. It felt like a gentle correction. I had always pictured preparation as buying dresses, planning events, picking colors. But this preparation was deeper. It was about building roots before flowers ever bloomed. It was about forgiveness, humility, patience, laying the bricks of emotional and spiritual maturity, not just romantic hope. And that's when I started confronting my fears. See, I had asked God for someone who could love me, but I hadn't considered how much I'd need to heal in order to receive that love without sabotaging it. I had patterns, self-protection instincts, walls built from past disappointments and silent vows like, I'll never let someone get that close again. So God gently started tearing those walls down. One night in prayer, I was reminded of something I said years ago in anger. I'd rather be alone than risk being disappointed again. And the Holy Spirit whispered, you can't build covenant on that foundation. Let me rewrite that vow. So I did. I repented. I released it. I asked God to help me risk again, not foolishly, but faithfully. Not because Elias was perfect, but because God had proven he was trustworthy. And then came the moment I hadn't expected. I was journaling one afternoon when I heard the Lord say, now tell him. I paused, pen hovering over the page. Tell him? Tell Elias about the angel? About the dreams? About the words I'd heard? It felt too big, too risky. What if it scared him off? But God was clear. Trust the timing. Tell him what you've seen. So I did. We met at the same park where we'd hiked the first time. I didn't rehearse a script. I just shared my heart. I told him about the night in my room when the presence of God overwhelmed me and Archangel Michael showed up. I told him about the words I heard, about the seed, about the dream that mirrored his. I told him I hadn't wanted to say anything until I knew it wasn't just in my head. When I finished, I braced for awkward silence, but Elias didn't blink. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, I've been waiting for you to say that. And then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn notebook. Inside were months' worth of journal entries, dreams, confirmations, scriptures, questions he'd asked God. And there, scribbled in bold ink on one page, I believe she's the one. The name isn't what I expected, but the peace is undeniable. I couldn't breathe. He'd known. Maybe not the details, maybe not the full weight of the supernatural, but he had felt it too. God had been preparing both of us in parallel, and now the threads were finally being woven together. Not with chaos, not with confusion, but with clarity. It was a covenant in progress, not sealed by rings or vows yet, but already being formed in heaven's hands. And I realized something else. This story, it was never about me just finding love. It was about God revealing himself as Father, as matchmaker, as the one who sees every prayer, every journal entry, every heartbreak, and still whispers, I'm not done writing this. After that day in the park, something shifted. Not just between Elias and me, but inside of me. It was like every fragmented piece of trust, every hope I had carefully tucked away out of fear, finally exhaled. Not because the journey was over, but because I had finally stepped into the part of the story where I could breathe without flinching. We weren't officially dating. We hadn't made any formal declarations. But there was an understanding, a mutual knowing that we were walking towards something sacred together. Still, we didn't rush it. Elias was steady, and he made space for me to keep healing. And I did the same for him. We talked about everything, our pasts, our pain, our callings. He shared how he'd always expected to marry someone completely different. I thought I'd end up with someone louder, someone more in the spotlight. I guess, he confessed once. But you carry fire without needing to be seen. That stuck with me, because that was the kind of partnership I'd prayed for, one that burned quietly, but carried weight in the spirit. I didn't want a stage, I wanted impact, and God had paired me with someone who saw that in me before I fully saw it in myself. Around this time, God started speaking to me again in the early hours, what I now called the watch hours. Almost every morning around 3:09 a.m., I'd wake up not out of restlessness, but as if being called to attention. Each time, the atmosphere would feel charged, thick with the sense that heaven was moving, downloading blueprints into my spirit. One night, as I lay there half awake, I saw a vision. There was a large wooden table, weathered, sturdy. On top of it were two journals, mine and Elias's. An angel, Michael, I knew it was him, picked them up, opened them both, and began weaving the pages together like threads in a tapestry. It wasn't neat, it wasn't even chronological. But it was beautiful. Every tear-stained prayer, every confused entry, every declaration of hope and surrender, stitched into one seamless narrative, and I heard it again. This is a covenant I am writing. I wept. Because I had spent years thinking I had to figure it all out, make the right choices, guard myself perfectly, or I'd miss the person God had for me. But in that vision, it became so clear. This wasn't about me orchestrating anything. It was about me yielding, letting God write a love story that didn't need to be flashy to be eternal. The next morning, I shared the vision with Elias. He listened intently, then smiled in that quiet, steady way he did when he knew something was holy. I had a similar picture last week, he said. But it wasn't journals, it was bricks. God was laying bricks in a foundation, and each one had our names on it. Not his or hers, just ours. It was a house he was building, not physical yet, but spiritual. I couldn't stop the tears, because what we were walking into was bigger than either of us. It was a home in the spirit, a place where others would come and be restored, a covering, a ministry, not in the traditional sense, but in the way we lived, prayed, and carried the presence of God together, and that's when the resistance began. Because every covenant, especially a God-ordained one, gets tested. It started subtly. Miscommunication here, insecurity there, old wounds trying to resurface. The enemy doesn't mind a love story as long as it stays shallow. But as soon as it begins to carry kingdom weight, that's when the attacks intensify. One night, after an intense conversation that left both of us quiet and raw, I sat alone in my car and cried out to God, "Why does this feel so hard? Aren't you the one who brought us together? Shouldn't it be easier?" And I heard the clearest whisper, "I didn't promise ease. I promised evidence. Evidence that I am in it. And what I joined together, I also strengthen." That changed everything. We weren't being shaken apart, we were being fortified. We started praying more, together and apart. We fasted for a weekend and asked God to refine us individually before anything progressed relationally. And what God revealed in that fast was not romance. It was repentance. We had to unlearn habits we picked up in past relationships. We had to confront how we handled conflict, how we set boundaries, how we communicated under stress. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cute. But it was necessary. And at the end of that fast, as we broke bread together with a simple meal and held hands across a tiny kitchen table, Elias looked up and said, "I'm not here because it's easy. I'm here because God sent me. And I'll keep showing up, storm or no storm." That's when I knew. This wasn't just a man. This was my partner in covenant, not chosen by algorithm or chemistry or compatibility, but by divine instruction. He didn't look like what I expected. His name wasn't on any of the lists I once wrote, but his heart, it was home. And that's what Michael meant all along. The name is not what you think, but the promise is still what I said. It had been months since that first night when Archangel Michael appeared in my room, and still, the ripple of that moment hadn't stopped. The deeper Elias and I walked into this relationship, the more layers were peeled back. Not just about us, but about what it meant to truly partner with heaven. Because this wasn't just a relationship, this was alignment. We were learning how to hear God in each other's silence, how to cover each other in prayer before we covered each other in affection. We were learning how to fight, not each other, but for each other. And in every lesson, I saw more clearly why the angel had come with that strange, specific word. The name is not what you think. It wasn't about a literal name, I finally understood. It was about letting go of expectation, of the image I'd built in my head, the standards I had elevated, the criteria that had nothing to do with the spirit and everything to do with the flesh. I had wanted someone who looked the part, but God sent someone who carried the part, and with every step forward, the fruit of obedience started showing up in the smallest ways. There was a night when I had a panic attack out of nowhere. It had been years since something like that happened, and I didn't even know what triggered it. I sat on the bathroom floor, trembling, tears pouring down, unable to catch my breath. I didn't even have the strength to call Elias. I just texted a single word: pray. He didn't reply with a "what's wrong?" or "on my way." He just started praying, out loud, in the Spirit. He told me later he felt the Holy Spirit prompt him to drop to his knees and go to war. While I was shaking on the floor, he was pacing the kitchen in intercession, declaring peace and covering and deliverance. And within minutes the heaviness lifted. I felt a stillness fall over the room like a blanket. My breathing slowed, my body calmed. And in that silence I heard again what I had almost forgotten. This is what covenant does. It shields, it intercedes, it reflects my heart. It wasn't that Elias fixed it, it was that he carried it, and in doing so, he showed me that marriage wasn't going to be about solving each other's issues. It was about holding space for heaven to invade them. We weren't perfect. Far from it. We had days where communication was clumsy and our emotions got the best of us. But what made this different, what made this holy, was that we kept coming back to the altar. Not the literal one, the altar in our hearts, the one where we laid down our pride, our timelines, our fears, and asked, God, what do you want this to look like? And his answer was always the same: let me build it. There came a moment when I knew God was preparing us for the next step, not just emotionally, but spiritually. And so I asked him, what do I need to do now? He answered with a single phrase: sanctify the soil. I didn't fully understand at first, but he made it clear. Before a covenant is planted, the ground has to be cleansed of past entanglements, old soul ties, hidden idols, lingering unforgiveness, things I thought I had dealt with, but which still left traces in the corners of my heart. So I went into a season of deep personal consecration. I fasted, I prayed, I journaled honestly. Every unresolved hurt, every name I hadn't truly let go of, every lie I believed about love. And I repented. Not just for the wrongs others had done to me, but for how I'd sometimes chosen bitterness over healing, distance over vulnerability. And something incredible began to happen. The more I emptied, the more God filled. My dreams became clearer, my peace became deeper. The inner noise that used to cloud my ability to trust became silence where God could speak freely. And the picture he painted in that silence? It was Elias, standing at the edge of a field we had both prepared, waiting with a seed in his hand. I knew it wasn't time yet for the final vow, but it was time for the intentional yes, the one that says, I may not have the full blueprint, but I trust the one who's writing it. We decided to take a weekend retreat. No distractions, no phones, just time with God and each other. We found a small cabin tucked into the woods and spent our days in worship, scripture, and long, soul-bearing conversation. On the last night, as the fire crackled in the fireplace, Elias took my hand and said, I don't have a ring yet, and I'm not proposing today. But I need you to hear this. I'm not here by accident. God told me you're the one. And I'm asking for your agreement, not for a date on a calendar, but for a journey in obedience. I couldn't speak for a second. The weight of his words landed like confirmation on top of confirmation. And then, quietly, I whispered back, yes. Yes to the journey. Yes to the covenant. Yes to whatever God writes next. And right then, we prayed a prayer of commitment, not engagement, not marriage, but alignment. We asked the Lord to lead every step forward, to guard us, to purify us, to surround us with wise counsel, to shut every door not opened by his hand. And when we said amen, I felt it, the seal, the covering, the quiet approval of heaven. We walked outside into the crisp night air. Stars stretched across the sky like promises, and I knew this story wasn't just mine. It wasn't even just ours. It was heaven's, and we were only getting started. The drive home from that cabin was quiet, but not the kind of silence that means something's wrong. It was the kind of silence that sits heavy with glory, like the air was still full of everything God had just done. We didn't rush back into normal life. We didn't fill the space with plans or promises. We just drove, hand in hand, letting it settle. A few weeks later, things started shifting in the spirit again. I felt it first in small ways. A stirring in my spirit during prayer. A restlessness, not out of anxiety but anticipation. It was like the atmosphere around us was thickening, like something unseen was building, preparing to manifest. And then came the dreams. One night, I dreamed I was standing in front of a mirror. But it didn't reflect me. It reflected Elias. He was older, dressed in wedding clothes, but not the kind you'd see in a modern ceremony. His garment was long, pure, and radiant. And behind him stood a host of angels, watching, waiting. One of them stepped forward, Michael again, and handed Elias a scroll. On it were written 3 words: time to build. I woke up gasping, like I had just been launched into a new season without warning. And the weight of that phrase wouldn't leave me. Time to build. I shared the dream with Elias later that day. He didn't flinch. I've been feeling the same thing, he said. Like we've been in the preparation phase, but now God's asking us to move. Not just spiritually, but practically. That was the moment we realized we had to start building the life we were praying for, even before marriage was officially on the table. That meant making changes, taking faith steps, laying foundations, and one of those foundations was prayer. We started waking up early, often around 3 or 4 a.m., to intercede together, not just for us, but for our future, our families, the generations to come. We felt a strong call to break generational curses of divorce, of abandonment, of emotional silence and spiritual stagnation. We prayed for our children by name, even though they didn't exist yet. We asked God to raise them in an atmosphere of truth, of purity, of fire. Those prayer mornings weren't always smooth. Sometimes one of us would wake up tired or discouraged. Sometimes the room felt dry. But we showed up anyway, because covenant isn't built on feelings, it's built on faithfulness. And over time, those mornings became an altar where God kept meeting us. One morning, during a particularly heavy intercession, I felt the Spirit whisper, "There is oil on this union. Do not treat it casually." It wrecked me, because somewhere along the way I had started thinking of our story as just ours. But it wasn't. It was God's, and it carried a weight, not a burden, but a responsibility. That day we made a new commitment, to steward what we had like it already belonged to heaven, to treat our relationship like sacred ground. No secrets, no compromise, no emotional shortcuts, just truth, just transparency, just obedience, and God started opening doors. We were asked to lead a small group together, something neither of us had planned. We began mentoring younger couples, even though we weren't married yet. And in every conversation, every prayer, session, people would say the same thing. There's something different about you two, something that feels covered. And we would smile because we knew exactly what it was. It was the seal of God. It was Michael's words echoing in the background. But even as we stepped forward, opposition rose again. Old wounds flared up. Spiritual warfare intensified. Distractions showed up, tempting us to lose focus. And one night, after an argument that left us both emotionally raw, I found myself doubting again. "God, are you sure?" I whispered. "Did I really hear you right? Am I just seeing what I want to see?" And then, without warning, I felt that familiar presence, the unmistakable weight of the supernatural settling around me. I looked up, and standing at the edge of my bed was Michael. No wings, no trumpet, just presence, authority. He didn't speak audibly, but I heard him clearly in my spirit. "You are afraid of the unknown because you forgot who sent you into it. This is not about clarity. This is about covenant. Go forward." And just like that, he was gone. But the fear left with him. I called Elias that night, told him everything, and he said something I'll never forget. "If this is a war, then I'm honored to fight it beside you. Not because you're easy to love, but because you're worth it." And I wept, because that was the kind of love I had prayed for. Not perfect, not polished, but present, fierce, steadfast, Christ-like. We started talking more seriously about the future. Not just about marriage, but about purpose, about legacy, about what kind of world we were going to build together. We didn't want a perfect house, we wanted a prophetic one. One filled with worship, laughter, hard conversations, late-night prayer, and deep joy. And one day, as we walked through a neighborhood we both liked, Elias stopped in front of a simple 2-story house with ivy climbing the walls. He looked at it, then looked at me and said, "I don't know why, but this feels like the kind of place where heaven would live." And in my spirit I heard it again, time to build. The house with the ivy became more than just a structure in our conversations. It became a symbol, a signpost pointing toward a future we weren't yet ready to claim but couldn't deny, was already being prepared. We started making plans, small ones at first, talking about what we'd do if God opened that door, what kind of hospitality we wanted to offer, how we wanted the walls of our home to echo with worship and laughter, with healing and hope. In the meantime, life kept testing us, refining us. One day, I was scrolling through my phone and saw a message from an old flame, a name I hadn't thought about in years. For a moment, my heart faltered, that old familiar ache threatening to surface. But before I could respond, I felt it, a heavy sense of peace wash over me, a reminder that God had a plan far greater than any past mistake or missed opportunity. I prayed and asked God for clarity, for strength to close that chapter completely. And I felt Michael's presence again, this time in a way I couldn't ignore. He reminded me that the name we often fixate on, the name of the past, the name of what could have been, was a distraction. The one God had for me carried a different kind of name, a name written on my heart, etched in covenant, sealed by the Spirit. It was a name that transcended the flesh, transcended expectations and history. It was a name that whispered, "You are loved beyond what you've ever known." I shared this revelation with Elias, and together we declared freedom over our pasts. We agreed to not just walk away from old wounds, but to step into new promises with open hands and hearts. Around this time, a minister friend approached us about a marriage retreat they were hosting. Neither Elias nor I were ready for a wedding, but we sensed God saying yes to this, a chance to deepen our foundation, to prepare spiritually and emotionally for what lay ahead. At the retreat, surrounded by couples at different stages of their journeys, we were reminded that covenant wasn't about perfection, it was about perseverance. It was about showing up, even when you're scared or unsure. And in one session, the speaker said something that hit me like a lightning bolt. "You're not marrying the person you think you are. You're marrying the person God is making you become." That phrase stuck with me. Because the name wasn't the point. The person God had destined me for wasn't just a name or a face. It was a soul on a journey of sanctification, just like mine. Elias and I left that retreat with renewed commitment. We started dreaming together again, but this time with less anxiety and more peace. We talked openly about the fears we had, about failure, about losing each other, about the unknown, and instead of pushing those fears away, we invited God into them. We learned that love isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to trust God in spite of it. One evening, as we were praying, Elias suddenly stopped and looked at me with something serious in his eyes. "I'm ready to give you a name," he said softly. I laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" He smiled, a little shy but sure. "The name that matters. The one written in heaven. The one that no one else can see but us." I realized then that the name Archangel Michael had spoken about was never meant to be a literal name. It was a covenant code, a spiritual marker of identity and destiny. It was a name of promise, a name of purpose, a name that bound us together, not because of who we were, but because of who God was making us to be. Together. And as I looked into Elias's eyes, I finally understood. I was not destined to marry a name. I was destined to marry a calling. The house with the ivy became more than just a structure in our conversations. It became a symbol, a signpost pointing toward a future we weren't yet ready to claim, but couldn't deny was already being prepared. We started making plans, small ones at first, talking about what we'd do if God opened that door, what kind of hospitality we wanted to offer, how we wanted the walls of our home to echo with worship and laughter, with healing and hope. In the meantime, life kept testing us, refining us. One day, I was scrolling through my phone and saw a message from an old flame, a name I hadn't thought about in years. For a moment, my heart faltered, that old familiar ache threatening to surface. But before I could respond, I felt it, a heavy sense of peace wash over me, a reminder that God had a plan far greater than any past mistake or missed opportunity. I prayed and asked God for clarity, for strength to close that chapter completely. And I felt Michael's presence again, this time in a way I couldn't ignore. He reminded me that the name we often fixate on, the name of the past, the name of what could have been, was a distraction. The one God had for me carried a different kind of name, a name written on my heart, etched in covenant, sealed by the Spirit. It was a name that transcended the flesh, transcended expectations and history. It was a name that whispered, "You are loved beyond what you've ever known." I shared this revelation with Elias, and together we declared freedom over our pasts. We agreed to not just walk away from old wounds, but to step into new promises with open hands and hearts. Around this time, a minister friend approached us about a marriage retreat they were hosting. Neither Elias nor I were ready for a wedding, but we sensed God saying yes to this, a chance to deepen our foundation, to prepare spiritually and emotionally for what lay ahead. At the retreat, surrounded by couples at different stages of their journeys, we were reminded that covenant wasn't about perfection, it was about perseverance. It was about showing up, even when you're scared or unsure. And in one session, the speaker said something that hit me like a lightning bolt. You're not marrying the person you think you are. You're marrying the person God is making you become. That phrase stuck with me. Because the name wasn't the point. The person God had destined me for wasn't just a name or a face. It was a soul on a journey of sanctification, just like mine. Elias and I left that retreat with renewed commitment. We started dreaming together again, but this time with less anxiety and more peace. We talked openly about the fears we had, about failure, about losing each other, about the unknown, and instead of pushing those fears away, we invited God into them. We learned that love isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to trust God in spite of it. One evening, as we were praying, Elias suddenly stopped and looked at me with something serious in his eyes. "I'm ready to give you a name," he said softly. I laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" He smiled, a little shy but sure. "The name that matters. The one written in heaven. the one that no one else can see but us. I realized then that the name Archangel Michael had spoken about was never meant to be a literal name. It was a covenant code, a spiritual marker of identity and destiny. It was a name of promise, a name of purpose, a name that bound us together, not because of who we were, but because of who God was making us to be. Together. And as I looked into Elias's eyes, I finally understood. I was not destined to marry a name. I was destined to marry a calling.